Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn and happy to be with you this evening. We are running a couple of days late due to some technical difficulties, but I'm happy as heck to be here to talk about the big news of the week. Remember last week I said there was almost too much news going on? It's hard to keep track of all of it, and things got lost in the shuffle, and it's hard to know what's real, what isn't. This week was more of the same. And so we're going to talk about and using air quotes here, the extraditions of a number of narcos from Mexico into the United States. Before we do that, though, I want to mention a news story that might have gotten lost in the shuffle. And most of this comes from the Latin Times, so I'm just going to kind of read it for you. On February 28th, members of the Mexican National Guard were patrolling a small town in southwest Jalisco and noticed suspicious activity from a man, and they decided to follow him. After investigating and arresting the subject, he was identified as Abraham Aseguro Cervantes, also known as Don Rodo, the older brother of CJNG leader El Mencho. According to Mexico's Secretariat of Security and Citizen Protection, El Rodo was arrested alongside 3 other Jalisco cartel members. All 4 subjects were armed and carried a small quantity of drugs as well as cash. As reported by Infobay Mexico, El Rodo formed part of Mencho's criminal enterprise, helping with money laundering and purchasing properties all around Mexico. According to authorities, Don Rodo worked alongside notary public offices in Ciudad Guzman and other places to manage changes of ownership of the properties he purchased for El Mencho. On top of that, reports suggest that El Rodo's wife, Virginia Leon Osornio, also plays a major role in the cartel's real estate master plan by purchasing and investing money on gold mines located in the states of Michoacan, and Nayarit. After Mexican authorities secured the arrest, El Mencho's older brother and the other 3 suspects were transported to central Mexico, and 2 days later, El Rodo was in front of a federal judge for a hearing. After a long hearing, the judge determined that Don Rodo should be transferred to the infamous maximum security prison, Altiplano. So wanted to make sure you were aware of that. As we've talked about before, and I think we talked about it last week with respect to Los Chapitos, it's real easy to say, ooh, major loss for CJNG. And on its face, it clearly is. What long-term effect that will have, we'll have to see. But a significant blow to CJNG at a time when most of the focus has been on CDS, the fight within CDS, and more particularly arrests of members of Los Chapitos. So now I want to talk about the extraditions. And let me tell you what I'm going to do. There are hundreds of news reports out there about these. And I'm not going to repeat those. Okay, I'm going to go through a little bit of the facts, but when they took off and how many planes there were, not going to do that, right? You can go find that. And lots of people have talked about it. And I don't think that's necessarily what's most important. So we're going to talk about the extraditions. We're going to talk about some of the bigger names that were involved in that extradition. And then I want to talk about what does it really mean. And we'll talk about that in a couple of different ways. So, what do we know for sure? Okay. We know that in the middle of the night last week, actually, let's rephrase that. That's probably not the best way of saying it. But we know that one or more planes left Mexico for one or more destinations in the United States, again, depending a little bit on which report you're looking at. The big key is the passengers on those planes were 29 narcotics traffickers who were in jail in Mexico. So they were sent to the United States. Everybody calls them extraditions, right? They were extradited. Everybody, that is, except the Mexican government. And why? Well, extraditions in Mexico have to go through a particular judicial process. These extraditions did not go through that process. So what Mexico has said is these weren't extraditions, but were expulsions for reasons of national security. What's the practical impact of this? Maybe not much, because we know even if a judicial proceeding was to be held in Mexico, and assume that that judicial proceeding resulted in an order saying that the extradition was not legal, not proper, the Mexican government would then have to go to the U.S. government and ask them to repatriate the prisoners, right? All of whom are in custody in the U.S. The likelihood that the U.S. would in any way conduct such a repatriation is minimal at best. So at most, a litigant saying I was extradited improperly would likely get a Pyrrhic victory, right? But it is important to note, and it's going to be important to see how these renditions, how these extraditions impact future extraditions, future extradition requests from the United States. As I think I said earlier, the best number I've seen, the most consistent number I've seen, is that there were 29 narcos that were extradited. There are plenty of websites that show pictures of all of them with their first names and their aliases. Their eyes are blacked out in all of those. But if you want to see who they are, that's not very hard. So who are the important names? In my mind, there's really three sets, maybe four people that I think are the most important to know. One was Jose Angel Cannabio Isunza, known as El Garrito. He had been indicted in a federal court in Chicago last year. Remember, he was only recently arrested, but he was considered to be a top advisor to and security chief for Yvonne. Okay. The fact that he was so quickly rounded up as part of this extradition, I'm just going to say extradition for convenience, but the fact that he was so quickly rounded up and part of this extradition is a bit stunning to me, and is significant, and I think we should pay attention to that. So that's number one. Number two, brothers Miguel Trevino, Z40, and Omar Trevino, known as Z42, who had led the Zetas. They were also part of this extradition process. You remember, we've talked about them a lot. They were kind of the successors to the original founders of the Zetas. They also then were the leaders of and kind of the formers of the Northeast Cartel. And Interestingly enough, the Northeast Cartel was one of the organizations named as a foreign terrorist organization by the Trump administration earlier this month. The superseding indictment in Chicago, or in a superseding indictment in Chicago last year, the prosecutors said that the two continued to run the CDN, as it's now known, from prison in Mexico. Miguel and Omar Trevino are alleged to be personally responsible for committing dozens of murders and for directing assassinations, kidnapping, and acts of torture by Los Zetas and CDN members, the Justice Department said in a statement last year when that superseding indictment came down. So they also were part of the extradition and were taken to Chicago. What about CJNG? They had somebody as well, Antonio Oseguera Cervantes, the brother of El Mencho. If you remember, we've talked about him a lot. His alias is Tony Montana. When he was arrested, he was identified as one of the main financial operators of CJNG. He also was said to be in charge of providing weapons for confrontations and for battles against rival groups and against Mexican authorities. If you remember, he was arrested on December 20th, 2022. Again, at the time, that was considered a huge blow to CJNG since he was one of the leaders of the organization. And yet it's hard to point at this point in time to anything specific that we could say CJNG has suffered as a result of El Tony Montana being in custody. Then there was Rafael Caro Quintero. He was extradited on Thursday and taken to Brooklyn, New York, where he faced multiple drugs and weapon charges in the Eastern District of New York, but not guilty to those through his counsel. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. Today is a historic event. Frank Tarantino, the special agent in charge of the DA's New York division, said at a press briefing outside the courthouse following the hearing, "We have waited 40 years for this day when justice would be served." A DE agent was allowed to join U.S. Marshals in escorting Caro Quintero from the courtroom, a symbolic gesture coming 40 years after the death of Agent Camarena. Quote, "After 40 years, the man who murdered Enrique Camarena is finally facing justice in the United States," said the assistant U.S. attorney. "Justice never forgets." The U.S. attorney, or the assistant U.S. attorney, said Caro Quintero pioneered drug trafficking and then violent enforcement of his cartel's turf. Not completely sure I agree with the characterization of him pioneering drug trafficking, but be that as it may, he is in prison in New York, and the DE agent in charge in New York said one more thing. Rafael Caro Quintero, the man responsible for Kiki's kidnapping, torture, and murder in 1985 in Guadalajara, Mexico, will answer for his crimes. We're going to talk about that now. All right, so these are the big ones, right? These are the big people that were arrested or that were extradited. And in some respects, it's a big coup for DEA, big coup for the Justice Department. But I want to talk about what it means, right? So let's first talk about the Zetas. A couple of things about the extradition of Z40 and Z42. Number one, to the extent that people were talking that kind of an old school Zetas undercurrent still existed, this extradition of these two brothers likely is the end of the end of the end of the Zetas and any lineage directly to the old school Zetas.
Right.
Is that a big deal? Probably not, because as we said, there's a CDM, there's some of the new Zeta entities, and we've talked about those in the past. But what is significant, remember we had former DEA agent Leo Silva on a couple weeks ago and talking about the Zetas and their amazing rise, their grab of power, their brutality, their willingness almost to take on the government, the military, the National Guard. They really started the ultra-violent renaissance of the cartels. To say that entity, as I say, any direct lineage back to those original Zetas is done, is significant. And it is important, even if on a day-to-day basis it may not change activities or drug trafficking or anything else in Mexico. All right, I want to talk about Caro Quintero for a few minutes. There are a number of things that are significant in my mind. One of the things I want to note is all of these extraditions, and when we first started hearing about them, and then there were bits and pieces of news, and it actually, going back to the Zetas, it was the sheriff in Laredo, Texas, who may have given it away a little bit, because in the morning he warned people in Nuevo Laredo to be careful because there could be violence as a result of some type of extradition, and people put two and two together, and then that added to other things. But while that was all going on, there was all the hubbubaloo in Washington, D.C. with President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance, and all of that was going on. So in a lot of ways, these extraditions took a backseat to that. But even more so, quite frankly, when we did find reports that talked about the extraditions, Caro Quintero wasn't necessarily the biggest discussion. Right. Those of us who follow this carefully, those of us who have been involved in the Camarena case or followed the Camarena case for a long time, some of us 40 years, some of us 35, me 30, on the latter. But for us, the arrest or the capture, the having Caro Quintero in federal court in the United States was a big fucking deal. And it didn't get reported that way. And I read quite a bit on social media. And, it seemed to be a little bit of, he's an old man. He was one of the old school, old guard cartel members, and frankly, nobody cares anymore, which really, really bothered me. And I think that his capture or his extradition, the fact that he's in the United States, that he's going to face charges, is significant. It's important. And to those who worked with Agent Camarena, to those who knew Agent Camarena, to the dozens, if not hundreds, of law enforcement officers who went to Mexico to search for and investigate the kidnapping or the disappearance of Agent Camarena, and most importantly, for Agent Camarena's family, his wife, his sons, his sisters, to see the man responsible. Now, note, we've talked about outstanding questions, but to see this man in handcuffs in a federal court in the United States is significant. It's huge. Frankly, it's a day I didn't think would ever come. I mentioned the handcuffs. So there's a great story, and I'm only going to try to repeat what's been publicly said. But the DEA agent in charge of Operation Landa, and I'm not going to mention his name. I think it's been in the news, but I'm going to be careful. But let me say, he's a hell of an agent and a really good guy. He went, when the news came out that Caro was on one of these planes that was going to the United States, he drove to San Diego, California. Kiki Camarena's son, Kiki Jr., is a judge in San Diego. Kiki Jr. happened to have a pair of handcuffs that his father had. And he gave those to this DEA agent to take to New York on a red eye. To take to New York so that when Rafael Caro Quintero was being led out of the courtroom following his initial arraignment, he was in handcuffs that belonged to Kiki Camarena. If that's not karma, I don't know what is. It's a great story. And I hope more gets known about it. The other thing that's very significant, we talked about this a long time ago, so people may not remember or might not have heard. Rafael Caro Quintero was under an indictment in the United States in at least 2 jurisdictions. One being the Eastern District of New York for drugs and weapons charges, which he answered to on Friday. The other is the Central District of California, where there is an outstanding indictment for him relating to the kidnapping and murder of Agent Camarena. You'll note that Caro Quintero was taken to New York, not to California. He is answered on charges relating to weapons and drugs, not charges relating to Agent Camarena. Why is that? Well, we've talked before that there might have been internal politics within the Department of Justice as to where he would go. I can't opine on that. We don't know exactly what was happening. There was some speculation that people thought the drugs and weapons charges would be the easiest to prove. And if you wanted to make sure you got a conviction against Rafael Caro Quintero, those are the charges you would want to have. Caro Quintero is, 75? Is that right? Hold on one second. 72, excuse me. So he's 72. If he's convicted on the drugs and weapons charges, in all likelihood, he dies in a prison somewhere in the United States. With any luck, he's in a cell close to El Chapo down in Florence. And when I drive by there, I'll wave at Caro Quintero and El Chapo. Okay. So maybe the idea was, hey, let's get him on the drugs and weapons charges, and then we can worry about or think about prosecuting him in California for Agent Camarena's murder. There are a few problems with that. One is Agent Camarena's murder was in February 1985, 40 years ago. The number of witnesses that are still alive has to be decreasing. And if you have a trial and maybe some appeals in connection with the New York case, when are you going to be able to do a case in California if the DOJ wants to? And what witnesses are you going to have? Who's going to be available? Who's going to have, lucid minds enough to testify in a murder trial against Rafael Caro Quintero? So that's part of it. But let me tell you the other part. And all of this is my opinion. Okay? Let me say that from the very beginning. People can agree with me. People can disagree with me. People can be mad. People can be happy with what I said. But if there is not a prosecution of Rafael Caro Quintero in connection with the murder, the kidnapping, the torture, the brutal torture, the interrogation, the additional brutal torture of Agent Camarena, if Caro Quintero is not prosecuted for that, I blame it on one man and one man alone, and his name is Hector Berreyes. Why do I say that? So, several reasons. But let me give you the most prominent ones. Since the end of the Zuno trials, and some of the appeals, so since the 90s, Hector has come out at various times and said various things. And, I think some of us who were impacted by those or listened to those were not overly concerned. And then, of course, came the last narc. So you had Hector Berreyes and his three witnesses, Jorge Godoy, Rene Lopez Romero, and Ramon Lira. And if you want to cross-examine, let's say there's a murder trial, and you got to put somebody on the stand, right? Kind of like they did in Zuno 2. Shoot, we got to find somebody. Hey, we've got these three. Hector has these three witnesses, Godoy, Lopez, and Lira. Great. There is so much cross-examination material in The Last Narc, not even counting the outtakes. Can you imagine going and subpoenaing Russell Tiller or Amazon Studios for all the outtakes, all the notes? Oh my God, that's a defense counsel's dream. Not even to mention if you put those guys on the stand. Can you imagine Jorge Godoy on the stand if he's anything like he was in The Last Narc, where he was batshit crazy and nobody denies that? Moreover, we talked about this a number of times on here, but the amount of information out there, the amount of information I have sitting within my arm's reach to impeach Godoy and Lopez is stunning. So, you got Hector Berreyes saying, here are the people involved, right? Or here are the people who know. They testified against Zuno. They can testify against Caro Quintero, right? No. They'd be impeached. Oh my God, it'd be crazy, I believe. And then you start talking about who else would be available to testify, and you start wondering if there would be enough witnesses of critical information to satisfy the prosecution's burden of proof. Now, keep in mind, if a case goes to a jury, Caro Quintero is guilty. A jury in the United States of America, whether it's the Central District of California, Eastern District of New York, or anywhere else in this country, is not going to render a not guilty verdict against Caro Quintero. It's not going to happen. But, especially with respect to the Camarena case, there is a certain burden that the prosecution has, and could they have the ability to satisfy that burden? Would they have enough witnesses to satisfy that burden? Again, I'm not talking about the drug charges in New York. They can prove that. There are former DEA agents who can't wait to fly to New York and testify against him. That's different than the Camarena case. Here's the other thing that we have to keep in mind. Hector Berreyes has said on many occasions, look at me, former head of Leyenda, I know what I'm talking about. The real party responsible for the death of Agent Camarena, who participated in his abduction and or interrogation and murder, was the United States Central Intelligence Agency. I've been a trial lawyer. I'm not a great trial lawyer. Don't pretend to be. But I'm not bad. I don't think I'd have to be real great to say in opening statements, you're going to hear from the head of Operation Leyenda for a period of time. You're going to hear from his own mouth that the CIA was responsible for the abduction, interrogation, torture, and murder of Agent Kiki Camarena. You're going to hear it in videos he's given in the past, and you're going to hear it on the stand when we put him on the stand. Man, that's a good opening statement, right? The man responsible for investigating Agent Camarena's murder has said repeatedly on the record in videos that it was the CIA, not Caro Quintero. Put aside, for the moment, as we've talked about before, the complete and total absence of any corroborating evidence to support Agent Berreyes' assertion that the CIA was involved. Put that aside for the second. That's not going to matter. If I'm a defense counsel and I'm saying this is what he's going to say, that has to, ladies and gentlemen, that has to give you reasonable doubt. And you, Your Honor, whoever's trying it, it has to raise the question for you, can the government satisfy its burden of proof? And I also note, there are dozens of other things we can talk about where assertions made by Hector over the last few years would compromise the prosecution, right? What about the assertion that Felix Rodriguez was in the interrogation? No, he wasn't. We've talked about this 1,000 times. No, he wasn't. And it doesn't make any sense. And there's no evidence of it. None whatsoever. Other than maybe the testimony of Godoy Lopez or Lira, none of whom are credible. And I submit their credibility is so bad, a federal prosecutor with the ethical obligations of a prosecutor would be hard-pressed to justify putting any of them on the stand. I have talked a lot on this podcast and other places. I've written 2 books now, and I have a third coming that talk about the Camarena case and bring it all together as to what I think actually happened. Answer some of those questions we've talked about over the last year and a half or so. Some of the outstanding issues that just don't quite make sense. No matter how you kind of parse it, who was more responsible? Was it Ernesto Fonseca, as some believe? Was it Caro Quintero? Was it somebody from the Mexican government? There is no doubt at all in my mind that Rafael Caro Quintero was directly involved in the kidnapping, the interrogation, the torture of Agent Camarena. And if Agent Camarena's friends, his co-workers, his family, those who care about the case, don't see Rafael Caro Quintero in a federal court in California answering for those crimes, for me alone, I blame it on Hector Bareas and no one else. All right. One other thing I want to talk about with these extraditions. I want to talk about President Scheinbaum for a moment. So when, I mentioned this last week, when President Scheinbaum was elected, there were a lot of questions about to what extent she would follow AMLO's policies. She clearly was an AMLO protege, but her background was dramatically different. So there were questions of, when you're in the election, when AMLO's there with you, when AMLO has a press conference every day, it's not good politics to say, hey, as soon as I'm elected, I'm going to do different things. But there were reasons to suspect that she might not endorse the hugs, not bullets policy of AMLO, at least not in the way he has. And we talked about this last week. I think the evidence thus far, and we're now, 6 months into her administration, is that she does not believe in the hugs, not bullets policy. She has acted contrary to that policy, even if she has not publicly renounced it. And there is no question that in the last several months, there has been a renewed pressure on the cartels. The conventional narrative in the United States, and a lot of the media, has been President Trump came into office and threatened tariffs against Mexico and and Canada. And in response to those, and in connection with communications and phone calls, at least one reasonably well-known phone call, President Scheinbaum and President Trump came to an agreement that President Trump would postpone the tariffs, the increased tariffs against Mexico in exchange for the Mexican government sending about 10,000 National Guard members to the border. Many in the United States seem to suggest that this is a capitulation based on, the threat of the tariffs. Others said, you know what? She got something for nothing. Why? Because they'd already agreed they were going to send the 10,000 troops. They may have sent them a little bit earlier, but they were already going to do that. Whichever way you want to look at it, it was pretty clear in the last month that there was some level of cooperation going on. There were the troops going to the border. There are U.S. Surveillance flights that have been done. Most reports now indicate that they were done in association with the Mexican government and Mexican intelligence, and they were providing information to the Mexican military and National Guard in their battles and their fight against the cartels. Then President Trump says, hey, we're still gonna impose those tariffs. And all of a sudden, right before they're supposed to happen, 29 narcos get extradited to the United States. Again, super easy to say, oh man, Trump said we're going to do the tariffs. President Scheinbaum said, make sure that these 29 narcos go to the United States. And then today or yesterday, the tariffs are imposed anyways. Oh, President Scheinbaum. So she got pushed into the corner by President Trump, and she blinked and sent these 29 narcos to the United States. I'm going to suggest an alternative. What if this is what she wanted to do all along? Think about it. What is the one thing cartel people in Mexico don't want to have happen? They don't want to be extradited to the United States, right? There's a death penalty in the United States. There's Supermax in Florence, Colorado. And we've talked in the past about people being able to make deals and stuff, but then you've got to be the turncoat. You don't know how much information you have. If you want to send a tough message to the cartels, how much is better than I just sent a bunch of your brethren? I sent your brother, El Mencho. I sent your head of security, Yvonne. I sent one of the leaders of CDS. And if you want to go back before that and call it the Guadalajara cartel, big deal, you can. You're one of the old guard of Mexican cartels. I sent them to the United States. And you know what? If I capture your ass, I'm going to send you there too. Isn't that a great threat? And isn't the implication here, there's too much violence, too much fentanyl. If you read behind or between the lines or behind the facade, couldn't President Scheinbaum and the Mexican government be saying, tone it down at a minimum, tone it down. Stop the fentanyl. Stop the violence, especially in the border towns. And remember, we just talked about the likelihood of a Gulf cartel truce and a possible truce between elements of the Gulf cartel and CDN. Turn down the violence, stop the fentanyl, and maybe things go back to quote unquote normal. Until then, I'm going to continue to push. Right? There's a major arrest every day. I said it in my newsletter. I don't know if, if you don't get the newsletter, darn it, you really should. But it's free. All I need is an email. But somebody on Reddit said, oh my God, I'm surprised there's anybody left. Somebody gets caught every single day. And obviously they can bring in new people, but it's not the same, right? You don't have skilled people. You're bringing in anybody. She's going to keep up the pressure. There's going to be the arrest. Yvonne is not going to get lucky every time. This fits into her narrative perfectly. Can we prove that? Of course not. But I think, based on everything we know, that scenario is far more likely, in my mind, than the idea that she capitulated completely, sent all these people back, sent Caro Quintero, sent Z40, Z20, sent Tony Montana to the United States in the hopes that President Trump wouldn't impose additional tariffs? If so, that's not a good read on President Trump in my mind, and I think she reads him perfectly. All right, I've ranted and raved enough for tonight. We'll keep you informed of things going on. Who the heck knows what's going to happen next week, right? Going to pay very, very careful attention to some of the arraignments and some of the hearings coming up with respect to these recently extradited folks. And I do want to mention one other thing right before I go. I'm going to talk about this next week. Shameless self-promotion is very difficult for me. As I mentioned earlier, I've written 2 books. Someone Had to Die talks a lot about the Camarena case, goes into a lot of detail. It's a creative nonfiction, but it's very technically accurate. The second book is called Someone Had to Lie. It comes out next Tuesday, March 11th, and it talks some about the Camarena case, but it also talks an awful lot about the flow of fentanyl into the United States, and most importantly, maybe the role of the CIA in drug trafficking for the last 3 or 4 decades. There is a website that will be active tomorrow, llewellynwriting.com, where you can go and buy those books. If you buy them off that website, I'll sign them for you, ship them to you. And I think if you are interested in this subject matter, you will enjoy it. So that's llewellynwriting.com. With that, I will let you all go. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I'll see you next week on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Take care, everyone.